You already know, don't you, that creating artificial general intelligence, or AGI, is going to be significantly more complex than the current AI systems that we have right now. Typically right now, for example, we have an LLM, a transformer-based model, fairly simple algorithm, just repeated ad nauseum, out to endless lengths. And frequently to get reasoning capabilities or to focus its attention, we put a reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF, on top of it. So you got these two algorithms bolted together. Both of them conceptually. Transformers relatively new and simple. Reinforcement learning much older. Circa the late 1980s, early 1990s time frame. Paul Werbis talks about having thought about concepts for that as early as 1979. That's got real significant pedigree, significant funding, very bright minds working on it for well over a decade, a couple of decades. And so, of course, they have impressive results. But it's a very focused, let's get to the point kind of algorithm. When we talk about AGI, we want broader capabilities, a richer, more nuanced set of internal workings. So where are we going to find that? Very good question, you might ask. Okay, if we haven't met before, I'm Dr. Aliana Moren. My PhD is in theoretical physical chemistry. I mean, it's in chemistry. The theoretical physical is a special area. And I found that has been absolutely the right background for doing AI and AGI. And throughout my professional career, even though for the past 10 years I've been teaching at Northwestern, developing AI courses, teaching AI, for the breadth of my career, I've been dominantly an innovator. When I was the senior scientist and one of the founding employees of a small startup, truly AI, it was neural networks back then, startup decades ago, my work doing small business innovative research, grants and contracts brought in over $4 million to this small company. So I was a chief breadwinner there. Later, one of my innovations led to a patent, which was the basis for the company that I co-founded, receiving a $7 million initial funding round and a $4 million follow-on round. That was just before the 2008 crisis. So the company did what most companies, especially small startups, did right then. They died agonizing deaths. And I went into a period of like dark night of the soul. So I had been chief scientist on the board, initiating co-founder of that company, and all of a sudden I was without a home. And in the process of scaling back, bringing everything from the office to the home where I was living, and then preparing for a move to other parts, scaling back further, I was winnowing down my great collection of academic papers, multiple passes at winnowing it down. And towards the end, there were still boxes and boxes of papers, and I consolidated further and further. And there was one box, one tub that I put together of papers that I said, these are papers I really want to make sure that I look at as soon as I get my feet landed in some new place and have access to my stored materials again. Well, that access took 10 years. So I recently, it's not that I moved to Kauai. I moved here 3.5 years ago, and I moved to Hawaii, the Big Island, about 10 years ago. But I didn't get the stuff moved here until very recently. So here's the tub. And this was a small tub, very deliberately, like one that I could pick up and carry if need be. And it held certain very important little goodies, like my dissertation, actual hardcore written research notes, because I'm very old school about that sort of thing, 2 folders of stuff. And this is what I thought we would look at today. And I'm going to touch on some of these papers with you. Excuse me, getting that out of the way. I opened this tub up when I got my stuff a few months ago. And I looked through this, and I said, okay, this is what we've got, and no wonder I kept those papers, and no wonder I kept them, in a sort of safely secured, secluded thing, because we all know the way that we interact with things in digital folders, we may just totally forget that we've got something stashed away. Whereas if we have a chance to flip through physical hard copy, it may trigger something where we'd say, oh yeah, really that was interesting and I want to follow up there. But let's see what we've got, because what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass through this with you, and then we'll select 3 papers, and I will take them into the blog post and give more detailed descriptions and all the right links, and I will do a little bit of voiceover. What I'll do is select 3, and we'll probe them in a little bit more detail, but let's quickly just run through these real fast to see what we've got in this supposedly fabulous collection. And by the way, all these papers are from more than 10 years ago. More than 10. So this one is like it's an archive paper from 2015, and it's on the cluster variation method. The cluster variation method is statistical physics, pure hardcore stat phys. And I find it useful because it is going to be an intermediary between neuro and symbolic. But we'll talk about that at a different time, a different day. Moving on. Alrighty, this one. Classic. Absolute oldie goldie. Or goldie oldie is, depending on how you'd say it. Okay, you probably have heard of this one. Understanding Belief Propagation and Its Generalizations. This is Yedidia, Freeman, and Weiss. It's 2002, so this is, 23 years old. But why it's interesting is this notion of belief propagation. And belief propagation is going to be important as we start building world models that are really intrinsic to the AGI. They're going to be inside the AGI. We're not just going to constantly generate, and sort of reaching out into the probabilistic associations of what comes next after what, which is a hell of a way to try to find facts. I mean, just like, no, not. So we're going to go back, and it's that neurosymbolic idea. We're going to start pulling the two together. We're going to go back to symbolic representations. We will include them. But, a symbolic representation, drawing on ontologies, can be very broad, very large. And the question becomes, if we activate one part of a belief system or an ontology, what else do we want to activate simultaneous with it, or give it even just a little tiny bit of a goose so it might become more readily activated? So some of this classic old stuff on belief propagation, that's worth, I would say everybody who's going into AGI should probably know about this a little bit. So when I went back and looked at the papers in this tub, I realized that each of them was a pointer to a specific area of AGI architecture. That is, no paper was super significant in and of itself. Well, maybe the Burbus paper. But together, they represented, each of them, a pointer into an important area in AGI architectures that we will be addressing. And each of them requires depth. None of these are trivial. So as we go through, I'll make some comments, some interjections like this, and also I'll be building on that a little bit in the blog post. One more comment. My apologies here for the audio quality. I shot this vid right after completing the blog post for the predecessor vid, and I had a little bit of energy and a little bit of impetus, and I just grabbed the laptop and the mic and ran outside and shot the next round. So apologies regarding that. It's a little tricky to find a time in Hawaii here that is both quiet and has good ambient light. Now this one, once again, description box, blog post. Blog post is going to have descriptions and links and proper citations for everything. Okay, this one. It's called Swiss Army Knife and Occam's Razor, Modeling and Facilitating Operators' Comprehension. And the reason that I think it's so important, it's talking about comprehension, mental grasp. This paper will identify 2 contending metaphors of the mind and outline a model of comprehension informed by the parsimony principle, Occam's razor. This paper by Ufik and Sheridan is important to us because it addresses comprehension. And let me just briefly read you just a couple sentences that position this in our minds. So they say in the introduction, traditionally, cognitive models were interested in search, but had little, if anything, to say about problem conversion. The VAN, that's Virtual Associative Network model, attempts to fill this gap. The model attributes comprehension to a form of information
integration, which is unique to the human memory and diminishes the need for search. And this is an important topic. We have just gotten out of the search era. We've had this brief transition time in the transformer era, which is strictly probabilistic generation, and slapping a reinforcement learning model on top of a large language model is not really going to take us into AGI. We know that. So the thing to do right now is to take the simplistic models, put them in a box, take them off the table and put them to the side, and start thinking about the whole problem of AGI in its fundamental sense, ab initio, and start building from real basic principles forward. This paper gives us sort of a thought process, a framework for that kind of consideration. So yeah, it's an easy enough read. I do recommend it. Links in the blog post. So moving on, let's look at a control method, this one invented by Paul Wurbis back in the early 1990s and early 2000s. This is a complement to what I've been discussing lately in terms of the active inference developed by Friston and colleagues. Paul Wurbis, you know that he invented backpropagation, 1974, PhD dissertation, Harvard, etc. You know all of that. Then, now this is a weird-ish part of the story that not that many people know. Then, after a little bit here and there, he went to the National Science Foundation, NSF, and became the program director for their computational engineering neural networks. I forget the exact, it was a neural computation program. And he held that position for a couple of decades. Very influential because he was the person who ultimately decided where the NSF money flowed in the neural networks community. And importantly, I don't think he's ever been appropriately recognized for this. He was one of the early funders for Bartow and Sutton on reinforcement learning. He had had early thoughts about reinforcement learning. He read the work by Bartow and Sutton and said, yeah, these guys are onto the right approach. And he gave them some of that initial juice that was so important, not just because of funding, because every little bit counts in the university, but also it was that validation, that credibility, that important confirmation of, yes, you guys are on the right track. So another area that he was more directly involved in the invention and evolution of this was something called adaptive critic. And right now he's got a stable adaptive control using critic designs. It's an adaptive critic architecture. Adaptive critic, look, it's a control method. It's a neural network-based control method. In the adaptive critic, you're going to have the input of a data stream. It'll be the representation of the reality, so to speak, but it's going to be, say, perhaps very process-oriented, so a stream of observations as opposed to static. And then you're going to have a model of that representation. If this is beginning to sound a lot like what I was saying in just the previous YouTube about Friston's work with active inference, there's a point. They're both somewhat related conceptually. Representation of reality, model of reality. In the adaptive critic, you have a critic, which would be a neural network, that adjusts the model until the model gets close to appropriately mapping the representation. Over in Friston's active inference, you have a model with parameters that you can adjust and the representation, and the mechanism for bringing the model into alignment with the representation is the Kullback-Leibler divergence, but then you twist and turn that a little bit, and really what you're doing is minimizing a free energy term where there's a nice big fat entropy term in the free energy, which guarantees system stability so long as you don't push the enthalpy parameters too far. Both of these are mechanisms or thoughts that are designed to bring us towards control of a system, and we are going to desperately need system control in AGIs, because we are going to have dynamic adjustment of parameters to do all sorts of things. I mean, multiple levels and layers of feedback and control. So we are going to need, as we build AGI scientist teams, not just developers, we're going to have some scientists and do some research here. Yes, we'll need people to work at the subsymbolic, the connectionist, the data processing, the input data level. Absolutely. Just the way that we have that right now. We'll want to have all that kind of ability to work multimodal. Of course we will. We're going to have, up at the top end, we're going to have needs for ontologists. We're going to go back to that. We're going to have connections between those two.
we're going to have control systems. Internal to the world model, external to the world model. We will need really good control engineers. So adaptive critic, active inference, both worth putting on the table and saying, what are these little beasties? How can we use them? Are they the right tools for our needs? Well, let's see what else is interesting. Entropy and self-organization in multi-agent systems. Oh God, this is 2001. And it's an autonomous agents type of thing. What they're after is, can we get stability? Can we get self-organization in a system, especially if we're going to have multiple little beasties all interacting with each other? The actions of collectives these days, that's going to be very, very important. I'm going to point you also within the blog post to some recent work, and I can't say the author's name right now, but I'll put it in there. This is becoming increasingly important. Again, it's control systems as well as stability. Okay, that's the best of this collection. The other folder, I just had a look at it. Again, haven't looked at this for a few months. It was my work. And we don't need to discuss that right now because I can dedicate all kinds of YouTubes, and I already have, to my own work using the cluster variation method, developing corticons, looking at it as a means to create a connection between subsymbolic connectionist data, etc., up to the ontological. Different discussion, different day. So what are we pulling out of all of this? Control engineering. I think that we haven't had that kind of phrase kicked about in the AGI community at all. I think that we haven't looked at dynamic parameter modification on the fly in these complex systems. But the brain, which ultimately is our chief reference system for an AGI right now, the brain is complex, multiple different kinds of processing units, different layers of processing, multiple feed forward loops, multiple feedback, all kinds of control systems. So yeah, let's think about that. Let's bring that forward. So in addition to methods for system control at all different levels within the system, we of course need different representations for knowledge. For far too long over the past few years, we've been relying on LLMs or other transformer-based methods, and the representation of knowledge is stored between the inputs and the tokens that are generated. And this has been shown to be far too limiting for our needs, especially if we want stable, trustworthy knowledge representation. So of course we need to revisit the notion of symbolic level representation. But coupled with that, we have the need to represent degree of belief. And that's why right now I'm finding this paper by Albarracin and colleagues, produced fairly recently, 2022, more relevant, more interesting, more to the point for our cultivating an understanding of how to assess beliefs within not just an individual AGI, but communities. This is the kind of thing very important for our work as we go on in developing AGIs. So if it was me and I was asking myself, which of these fine papers do I want to focus my attention on? The answer, for myself at least, would be the more recent Albarracin paper. The tricky part is 49 pages long. Okay, so about 39-ish pages once you've cut out the appendices, which are proofs and theorems and derivations, and the 144 references that are associated with this paper. There's still nearly 40 pages. The first 6-7 pages, very, very readable. Then we start getting progressively more and more into the hardcore Friston community, that is the active inference community-based equations. And the truth is, you can't just sit down and read them unless you know that stuff already and know it very well, so it just sort of glides along very smoothly. I'm having to refresh myself on just everything and teach myself at a deeper level. Here's some key points. We're just going to put these out here to wrap things up, and I'll pick up with this paper in a future YouTube because I think it exemplifies the kind of thing that's worth our attention. It sort of draws us into this active inference approach to working with agents. Very important. A side note here, I've been listening, I haven't gotten through the full YouTubes yet, but interviews with people like Jan LeCun, of course. More recently, Andrzej Karpathy, I just picked up on one of his recent YouTubes. And at various times, researchers such as these refer to reinforcement learning and say, this is not going to get us to AGI. It's not complete. We've got the leaders in our field,
people whom we respect, saying reinforcement learning will only get us so far, and we're at about that so farness limit. Similarly, they've got comments about LLMs. So we know we've got to go further. Active inference likely gives us a means for going further, and the math is just downright a bit more than most people are used to, which is why I think people haven't picked up on this to the extent that ultimately would be desired. Friston and his colleagues, such as Albarracin and colleagues in this paper, talk about their models being generative. And that's kind of a fundamental down at the base layer bit of knowledge that's needed in order to get into this work. And the problem for many people when we get to this is that most people, even really good, strong, solid AI people, don't have a very good, solid sense of what generative really means. It gets a little bit wrapped up in the notion of a transformer-based architecture, which of course is an example of a generative mechanism, but it's not the full picture. It doesn't give us the full level of grounding. So in order to understand generative, especially to order understand generative within the context of all of the Friston works, we need an understanding of just enough, just a little bit of statistical mechanics to get us through. And this is one of the many reasons that I devoted a good bit of time, like the past few years, putting together teaching materials, first for myself and then for others, on generative AI, which really devolves down to, as at least partially, statistical mechanics. And we offer a full-fledged short course on StatMech, just enough. It's the top 10 terms, but it's just enough to give you a working vocabulary. Links to that, of course, in the blog post. We do understand, all of us, that there's going to be a fairly significant time investment and energy investment for any of us in the community to come up to speed and be able to read papers such as this. Personally, I think it's really worth our time. And on that note, lovely to have a moment with you, and we'll see you again in a future YouTube. Thanks for joining. And by the way, if you want to be informed of these things, please don't trust it to the random chance of the YouTube algorithm and what time you happen to log in and see things presented. Please do. Not just do the usual like, subscribe. Of course, please, yeah, but please go over to the Themesis website, themesis.com. Go to the About button, hit it, scroll down, opt-in form, fill it in, get the email, do the confirmation, and here's the important thing. I had to do this morning myself when I was looking for my own emails from my own Themesis account. Go to whatever little folder they stash your Themesis emails into and draw it to your primary, because we send you notifications not only of the YouTubes and the blog posts, which often appear at different times, but special opportunities with us. We're discussing AGIs more and more. We're building up communities where we can discuss AGI. We're creating all kinds of special opportunities. So please do come join us. Look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, Aliana Moran from Themesis. Have a lovely day.